Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's discussion we are going to look at how tourism becomes a site of global inequality. Now, tourism is the most coming in industry that kind of fosters economic development, and with the process of globalization it is kind of considered as adding into the economic growth to mainly developing countries, and most of the government in developing country invest a lot of money in terms of ensuring that it is able to attract a lot of tourists from developed countries. Now, this coming in of people from a certain kind of a racial background also creates another level of inequality, and that is kind of constructed on certain stereotype and imagined notion of the country that one is visiting. So, tourism often perpetuates racial and ethnic inequality through the gaze of the other. Now, the foreigners are the ones who are going to look into the local people, and the local as commodity to be consumed becomes the other. Now, this gaze of the other is the most important concept in tourism studies. Travelers from wealthy, predominantly Western nation often view the local population through a lens shaped by colonial history and racial stereotypes. Criticism of tourism as a phenomena in general and of the role in development in particular can be summarized as follows. It involves exploitation of the labor force because of its low wages, excessive hours of duties, example in case of cruise line employees. Tourists have the means to travel, spend and consume experiences, while local population, especially in the developing countries, often rely on low wage jobs in the tourism industry. This dynamic relationship between the foreigners from wealthy developed nation and the local from the developed poor nation creates a relationship where the local economy becomes dependent on foreign visitors, limiting sustainable growth and economic independence. Wealthy tourists benefit from cheaper services and goods, while the local workforce remains underpaid, further perpetuating economic inequality. So, we have kind of a lot of understanding of how tourism boosts economic growth. It is kind of considered as the most growing industry. But however, there are certain negative understanding also, or there are certain negative outcomes of tourism. And one of the area where we see negative outcome is economic development and inequality. So, while tourism can create jobs, it does not always benefit local community. So, whatever the growth or the economic growth in terms of tourism is, it goes on to the state and does not increase individuals' capacity to increase their income. Rather, in any tourist place, any local person wants to sell something or set up a shop has to again give a certain amount of money to the local government, to the local state government, and therefore, it is not kind of entirely economically benefited to the local people. Many hotels and airlines are owned by foreign companies, which means profit often leave the country. So, you have a lot of foreign direct investments in the hotel and these tourist places. So, the money is not actually coming to the country, it is rather moving out. So, the another area where we see the negative side of tourism is that it kind of reinforces subservience. As tourism grows, there is often an increase in the number of service jobs that cater to wealthy visitors, because who are the ones who are going to be the visiting the area? These are generally people from rich upper class, and therefore, they have a certain taste. The services that they can afford cannot be provided from people from, say, the economically backward class. So, it is it is rather increasing the wealth of those who are already rich or the upper class, and therefore it reinforces a system where local people are in low status role, serving roles, and they are serving the wealthier tourist. And that is that there is a kind of an acceptance of inferiority. They would rather kind of behave or do in a way that they become more attractive. They are, and many a time you kind we do something which they get pleased and therefore give them a prize. The foreigners would give them some amount of money or anything in terms of not actually through exchange of goods and services, but in terms of the idea that they are poor, they are like a servant, so they are being given an extra tip. Now, here in this lecture, we are going to refer to the article by Bell on backpackers in the tourist industry in Africa, and here the understanding of tourism and inequality, the author is referring to two case studies. Now, both these case studies are kind of coming in from Africa, and in both it is showing how the subject of gauge is heavily edited for visual consumption. You know, so how you are going to present yourself so that the visual experiences increases, and the more the satisfied the foreigner is, more the money is going to come in. So, these two cases we seeing that how Africa is presented in a way that emphasizes danger and exoticness for tourists. So, in poor African country, the other, and that is the local African population, is constructed as potentially dangerous in and through tourism. Simultaneously, the construction of the other is pivotal to travel capitalism. Without the other at African visitor's side, there is no exotic being gauged and no service class to facilitate the visit. The locals are required as a safe part of the consumable experience, which depicts the inequality of the host servant class. So, it is a relation of client patron, you know. So, the patron is the kind of the rich, wealthy, upper class, the white population, and the servant are the underdeveloped African black population. So, that as I already said that inequality is at two levels. One is your imagination, where there is an imagination of the subordinate and the servitude, and the other is in terms of the power play, where those who have a more purchasing power and the other that becomes a commodity of gauge because of their low purchasing capacity. So, it is a fundamental irony that tourists are people wealthy enough to go to remote places. And look at the poor people. The urge to the exotic often involves a trip to such poor nations. So, it's many a time tourism is for several reasons. One could be to experience or kind of have a nice explore the area or to have a good understanding of the area. But in many cases, it's kind of an opportunity or a time when you are able to display the idea that you are more dominant, you are more powerful, and that experience of a kind of being powerful or being able to control the other or being able to kind of consume the other is provides more psychological satisfaction. Now, let us understand the two case studies which Catherine Bell is discussing in the article. The first case study is the guest at a backpackers hostel in Pretoria in South Africa, and case study 2 is the nomad adventure tourist, a group travelling by overland truck from Cape Town to Victoria. Now, both of these case studies reveals how Africa is curated and packaged for visual consumption by tourists. The continent is presented in a way that fits preconceived notions, often portraying it as a perilous and exotic destination. So, let us now look at the study 1, which is backpacker tourism. Now, backpacker tourism is a recent phenomena. That is, in a backpack means you pack your bag and kind of go for exploring any area. So these and these are generally done by young youth who kind of wants to explore or wants to do some kind of adventure. So this originated in the 1960s and 70s and has kind of increased since 1990s. Now even kind of we see a lot of YouTubers and making videos on the entire journey from the start, how they visited different tourist spot, to the experience, to giving a deep description of the food consumed, the culture, the language and everything. So these are generally kind of done at an individual level. So tourism can be a group activity, whereas it could be an individual experience. So the emergence of backpacking as a large scale contemporary tourism phenomena is related to certain distinctive traits in Western society and the position of youth in them. In the early days, Cohen differentiated between non institutionalized tourists and their institutionalized counterpart. The non institutionalized tourist compiled with the conventional features of mass tourism, particularly in their preference for being confined to the Western environmental bubble or tourist bubble, while the former were referred to as drifter or nomads. So, one was to kind of have a mass tourism in this, that it's a group which is moving, and most of these, when we look into the Western tourism, was that it was to confine themselves to the Western countries itself. However, or later on, it kind of started becoming the old idea that you are wandering and therefore like a drifter or a nomad. A variety of names have been used in literature since then to describe the drifter or nomad style traveler, but studies in recent years have tended to refer to them as backpackers. Most definition of backpackers refer to form related attributes of tourism as opposed to type related ones. So, it is kind of a lot of study in tourism studies differentiating between the forms of tourist, whether it is kind of exploring or going to get increase your awareness, knowledge about the place. Some most of the time people also get go to certain destination for stress or kind of a break from a monotonous life. So, there are different ways in which it is explained. Backpackers are generally young youth who are going in for exploration or adventure. So, here we talk about the case study where the author is mentioning about the backpackers hostel, which is located in Pretoria in South Africa. It is a highly secured hostel. Security officers are commonly patrolling all tourist accommodation including backpackers hostel. This place also served as a temporary home reminiscent of hippie communities in the 1960s and 70s. Residents were mostly German but included French, Belgian, and Swiss. All of them spent their time in leisurely domestic activities, looking, eating, chatting over coffee. So, it's a kind of a stress free engagement of the youth population. The researcher was surprised that the hotel was not used solely as a brief stopover convenience, but also served as a temporary home reminiscent of hippie communities. Residents escaping employment or other demands at home lived off their savings and acted out a rudimentary domestic life. Most were German, but others kind of belong to the other community. The days of these tourists were spent in leisurely fashions, cooking, eating, emailing, chatting, and occasionally in pairs of small groups, never alone, venturing out to the local shops to buy provision. Africa was perceived nervously and was experienced largely through anecdotes and rumors from incoming backpackers. The inhabitant of backpackers' hostel was single from their 30s to late 40s, wary of their job back home in teaching, internet technology, or self employment in small business. Their despondency was apparent. So that is how we going to it explains the experiences of the backpackers tourist. The second is nomad adventures tourist. Nomad is a commercial tracking company that takes travelers on journey across all southern African countries for 10 to 13 weeks. The researcher joined a truck to travel in camp across Namibia and Botswana to Victoria Falls. There were 14 travelers from 11 countries, range in age from 20 to 53, and all including the guides were whites. The traveler had successful careers, and also none of the traveler camped before, and thus it made the journey more adventurous. Several confided to the researcher that they would prefer more comfortable accommodation. The driver led the tour and his partner served as guide and cook. They did this for 4 years and didn't have a permanent home, and that is why the author has used the term nomad. They are on move, they do not have a permanent residence. Everyday camping routine afforded relaxation, security, and a sense of belonging in an otherwise alien environment, which was too dangerous to venture into without the guidance of the group leader. So the journey was kind of a journey in a truck from visiting from one area to the other. But what is different from the backpacker is that this is moving in a group in terms of kind of not a sole or an individual adventure. So the truck itself divided the boundary between the local people outside and the traveler. The traveler at the boundary contrasted control distinctively with the local people through whiteness, itinerary, internationalism, consumerism, and as gaugers. When they saw outsider, the bus window was other, the subject of their nervous gauge. So we can if we kind of imagine there's a truck full of outsiders who are traveling, and the moment they see some local people, they are kind of excited and experienced to have the possibility of the gauge of the other. And that is why the author Catherine Bell is using the phrase tribes of tourists. So tourism is here a category of consumption. The peer group as tutor in consumption sets fleeing standards about who and what to consume. So everything is not going to be consumed, So those that is exotic or that is kind of completely different or unique are the object or individual who would be consumed. Temporary communities are constructed by the act of consuming together. So if you have a number of foreigners coming in from say the America, they form a community because they have a common background or they belong to the same race, and the other commonality is that they are going to consume together. They are the people who are going to look into the others as commodity. So a subculture of various consumer types ebb and flow through consumer land. Such was the witnessed in both the tourist group, the backpackers and the truckers in Africa. In both the groups, observed number had decided to consume certain parts of Africa and joined consumption tribe based on the recognition of style and consumer goals. The comparatively modest level of daily consumption at each site indicated that each group had made decision about the type of tourism they would consume. This was reiterated on a daily basis by the style of consumption of each group. The nomad tour leaders dictated the activities every day with no option. So when we are looking into the gauge and the local becomes the other, The other form of gauge is the nervous gauge. So, one is that you are already having a stereotype of being the superior and the dominant, but yet there is certain amount of nervousness or there is certain amount of excitement because you are in others land, you know, you are not in your own place, you are not among your people. So, therefore, this gauge or the tourist gauge is also been referred by the author as a nervous gauge. So, from the very start of European contact with African, there was an already established tradition of blackness as evil. The devil was commonly represented as a black. So, you have since the colonial time, the Western kind of being the ruler and being ruled, you already had certain myths, you had certain historical understanding of black as dangerous, as evil. So, you know, you had a dichotomy between the good and the bad, the saint and the evil, and the white would fall on the right, on one side in terms of being the good and the saint, and the black would be considered as evil and dangerous. Now, these negative stereotypes have persisted and they are acted out in even such apparently politically innocent site as present day tourism. So, you know, there is a subconscious level of the functioning of these stereotypes. So, over the years there is colonial myths, colonial stereotypes of the black and the African communities have existed, and they are kind of being exhibited in a place which is not, which has nothing to do with racism, which has nothing to do with inequality. So, say you are going to visit a tourist spot in Africa, so it should have been minus the stereotypes of who are the people who are staying there. But the author is kind of trying to argue that the unconscious overt is there, and it kind of constructs or it affects the way you interact with the local people. So, so the tourist may be from a wealthy country, they may be very rich, so compared to the financial status at home. So, the foreigners are obviously those who can spend in terms of going to an exotic places to consume it. So, their financial status is much better than the local. However, the thin line is that though you are economically powerful, though you may be kind of politically powerful in your stereotypes, there is a certain amount of fear, there is certain amount of anxiousness, and this fear is kind of, this is the irony, is coming from the poor. This is coming on from the say the population which is considered as weak. So, you have the power of the weak which comes in, and therefore, the whole idea of this nervous gauge becomes significant in understanding the relation between the foreigner and the local. The research on these two backpackers group that set out to employ the tourist gauge in Africa shows that behind the gauge is the insecurity of the outsider. The subject of this study experienced anxiety about possible hostility that might be expressed with violence by the oppressed group, by the poor against the wealthy, and the violence towards the strangers by local. So, you have economic power, you may be dominant in your narratives, but there is a kind of reversal, or it becomes inverse, where you have this fear that you are in an unknown land, you are among the others, and therefore, your behavior or your interaction has to be under control, or you will be in a violent situation. In countries known for high rate of violence, including occasional incidents of violence against tourists, the tourist gauge is a nervous one. So, usual level of tourist gauge has become uneasy. So, it is not that kind of so easy that you can go and display your power and come out free. You can become a victim of a violence. So, when we look into this whole relationship between tourism and inequality, what we can conclude from the study is that the global tourist industry depends on a lowly paid servant class to provide for every need and whim of visitors. In a hotel lobby or on a tour to a minority ethnic village, for example, inequality is inherent in transaction. Among other purchases, the tourist is paying for confirmation of his or her privilege. While tourists spend record amounts of money on travel each successive year, at the same time, the incidence of global poverty increases annually. So, that is how we can have to go deep behind what is visible to understand the structured way in which race, ethnic differences play out even in a tourist place. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.